The rusted jaws of a bear trap slammed shut inches from Caleb's boot, the metallic clang echoing through the fog like a gunshot. He stood frozen in the West Virginia mud, his heart hammering against his ribs. But it wasn't the trap that made his blood run cold. From the thick gray veil of the woods came a voice, harsh, wet, and unmistakable, spitting the same cruel nicknames his father used to carve into his soul. His father, who had been buried in the frozen earth exactly 7 days ago. Caleb lunged for the safety of the manor, but the heavy oak door shrieked as new iron bolts slid into place from the inside. Through the glass, he saw his sister Evelyn, her face a gaunt mask of hysteria, her lips moving in a silent prayer as she backed away into the shadows of the hallway. As he hammered his fists against the wood, the house itself seemed to groan in response, and a rhythmic, heavy pacing began on the attic floorboards above his head. He wasn't just locked out of his inheritance. He was being invited into a trap that had been waiting for his return for a lifetime. Caleb Hayes killed the engine of his battered pickup truck, the silence of the West Virginia hollow rushing in to fill the void left by the dying hum of the motor. He sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, until his knuckles turned the color of bone. Outside, the gravel driveway surrendered to the viscous, rust-colored clay that defined this stretch of the Appalachians. Caleb climbed out, his boots sinking into a carpet of sodden, decaying leaves. He trudged toward the wrought iron gates, which stood like skeletal sentries draped in thick, pale growths of lichen. The air here didn't just hang. It pressed against the skin, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of wet earth and the cloying, stagnant scent of a death that refused to stay buried. A week had passed since they lowered Silas Hayes into the frozen soil of the family plot. Yet the heavy, suffocating spirit of funeral incense seemed trapped beneath the canopy of trees. Caleb reached into his pocket, his fingers curling around a heavy ring of brass keys. The cold metal bit into his palm, a sharp reminder of the burden he now carried. Above him, the towering pines leaned inward, their interlocking branches choking out the pale autumn sun and plunging the road into a state of permanent, gray twilight. He moved past the rusted carcass of an old tractor, its iron skeleton long ago claimed by the earth. Thick, rope-like stems of bindweed spiraled through the jagged holes in the radiator, as if the forest were slowly digesting the machine. Caleb reached out, his thumb brushing the crumbling fender. The metal disintegrated under his touch, leaving behind smears of reddish-brown dust that looked uncomfortably like dried blood. Further into the yard, the apple trees presented a grotesque display of neglect. Their limbs were gnarled and twisted into shapes resembling gouty fingers reaching for a throat. Beneath them, the fallen fruit lay in various stages of liquefaction, emitting a sweet, fermented odor that made Caleb's stomach churn. He flinched when a dry, brittle branch snagged the sleeve of his jacket, the wood snapping with a sound like a breaking finger. It felt as though a skeletal hand were trying to anchor him to the spot. Ahead, the manor loomed, its windows staring back at him like the milky, sightless eyes of a cataract patient, reflecting nothing but the encroaching fog. Every step Caleb took produced the rhythmic crunch of dead grass, a sound that felt unnervingly loud in the pressurized silence of the hollow, a silence that felt like a wire stretched to the point of snapping. The heavy oak door groaned on hinges that hadn't tasted oil in a decade. Caleb stepped into the dim cavern of the entrance hall, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. Near the cold hearth, the thin, spectral silhouette of Evelyn Hayes remained motionless. She looked less like a living woman and more like a sketch of one. Her face gaunt and her skin stretched so thin over her cheekbones it resembled aged parchment. In the flickering light of a single candle, her eyes possessed a feverish, unsettled glint. She offered no greeting, no movement of welcome. She simply pulled a faded wool shawl tighter around her narrow shoulders. Caleb felt a wave of icy disdain radiating from her, a chill that seemed to turn the very oxygen in the room to slush. Her lips were pressed into a bloodless line, and her long, trembling fingers worked a set of prayer beads with mechanical intensity. Caleb remained rooted to the threshold, hesitant to shatter the viscous, leaden stillness that had settled between him and his sister. Caleb broke the spell by dropping his leather briefcase onto a dust-covered side table. The thud echoed through the hollow house. He fumbled with the catches and pulled out a stack of crisp, official-looking documents, the legal headers white against the dark wood. His fingers moved with practiced journalistic speed, sorting through the papers while he spoke, his voice low and clinical. He explained the necessity of her signatures for the inheritance to proceed, but he kept his gaze fixed on the tarnished inkwell rather than meeting her eyes. He stated his intention clearly. He would remain in the hollow only as long as it took to finalize the paperwork and legally surrender his portion of the estate to her. Even as he spoke, Caleb was already mentally flooring the accelerator of his truck, imagining the sight of this decaying house shrinking in his rearview mirror. The urge to flee back to the sterile, predictable grids of New York became a physical thirst, a dry spasm that made it difficult to swallow. The silence shattered when Evelyn hurled a porcelain teacup at the wall beside Caleb's head. It exploded into a cloud of white shards that rained down onto the moth-eaten rug. Her voice, when it finally broke through her throat, was a jagged rasp. She called him a coward, a traitor who had traded his lineage for the cheap, neon glitter of the city. Her arm whipped out, a shaking finger pointing toward the overgrown family cemetery. She accused him of leaving Silas to rot in solitude, dying among the weeds while Caleb ignored the calls. Caleb felt a hot, familiar rage bubbling in his chest, his fists clenching until the tendons stood out like cords. Evelyn continued to vent her venom, reciting a litany of every unanswered letter and every missed holiday. A small vein throbbed in her neck, a frantic pulse that mirrored the palpable hatred vibrating through the room. Needing air that didn't taste of dust and resentment, Caleb wrenched open the door and stepped out onto the porch. Instead of relief, a wall of lippy gray fog rolled in to meet him. From the heart of that white opacity, a voice sliced through the damp air, harsh, barking, and unmistakable. It was Silas. The voice spat out the shameful, derogatory nickname the old man had used to break Caleb's spirit when he was a boy. Caleb lurched forward, his boots hitting the porch boards with a hollow thud as he squinted into the mist. There shouldn't have been a soul out there. Yet the insults continued, delivered with the specific, wet rasp of a lifelong smoker that Caleb had spent 16 years trying to forget. The hair on the back of his neck bristled. His heart hammered against his ribs like a panicked bird in a cage, driven by a primal echo of his father's hatred. Caleb stepped off the porch and disappeared into the fog. He ran blindly through thickets of ferns, the wet fronds slapping against his face like cold tongues. The voice of Silas acted as a lure, dancing just out of reach, leading him deeper into the tangled heart of the woods. Caleb's breath came in ragged gasps as he dodged moss-covered trunks. Suddenly, a glint of dull metal caught the corner of his eye beneath a layer of rotted pine needles. He twisted his body mid-stride, throwing himself sideways. The heavy steel jaws of a bear trap slammed shut exactly where his ankle would have been, the metallic clang echoing like a gunshot through the trees. Caleb hit the ground on his knees, staring at the rusted teeth of the trap. It was old, but the spring was strong enough to have shattered his bone. The forest around him fell into a sudden, unnatural hush, broken only by a distant sound. A dry, hacking laugh that sounded terrifyingly like Silas's cough, fading away into the depths of a nearby ravine. Stumbling and gasping for air, Caleb scrambled out of the brush and bolted back toward the house, his mind screaming for the sanctuary of four walls. He reached the porch and grabbed the heavy bronze handle, but the door refused to budge. It felt as though it had become part of the frame itself. Caleb threw his shoulder against the oak, and from the other side, he heard the heavy, rhythmic slide of new iron bolts. Hardware he hadn't noticed that morning. He hammered his fists against the wood, screaming Evelyn's name into the grain, but the only response was the sigh of the wind and the soft rustle of the fog behind him. His fingers slid uselessly over the cold surface of the door. Panic, cold and serpentine, began to coil around his throat. He was locked out, trapped on the threshold with the shadows of the hollow closing in. An eternity seemed to pass before the bolt finally shrieked back. Evelyn cracked the door open, her face a mask of sweat and pallor. She snatched Caleb by the sleeve and yanked him inside with a strength born of hysteria, slamming the door and throwing the bolts back into place with frantic speed. Her eyes darted to the dark corners of the ceiling, her parched lips moving in a frantic blur of half-remembered prayers and hissed curses. She claimed that something from the woods was trying to migrate into the house, seeking the cracks in the floorboards, and that only the old iron could hold the invisible enemy at bay. Caleb looked at her fractured expression and realized the terrifying truth. His sister wasn't afraid of the fog itself, but of what the fog had woken up. She pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes wide, demanding he listen to the heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing across the attic floor. Caleb yanked his phone from his pocket, but the screen mockingly displayed a lack of service. With a snarl of frustration, he hurled the device across the room. He turned and sprinted back out toward the pickup, jumping into the cab and jamming the key into the ignition. He twisted it with enough force to snap the metal. The starter gave a pathetic, wheezing groan before the entire dashboard went black, plunging the cabin into darkness. He slammed the truck into gear, but the tires merely spun in the rain-slicked clay, digging the vehicle deeper into the maw of the West Virginia earth. The fog pressed against the windshield like a heavy wool shroud, erasing the world beyond the hood. Caleb hammered his fist against the steering wheel, the realization sinking in like a stone. The estate wasn't just a property. It was a digestive system, and it had no intention of letting him go. He stood frozen in the hallway a few minutes later, when a sound began to bleed through the wallpaper. It was a dry, papery rustle, like dead leaves skittering across a floor. As the volume rose, Caleb's blood turned to slush. The voice whispering from the walls was his own. It was repeating the lies he'd told his editors, the excuses he'd made to avoid coming home, and the secret shames he'd buried under layers of city life. The very structure of the house seemed to vibrate, exhaling memories of stolen money and betrayals he thought he'd outgrown. Caleb pressed his palms over his ears, but the whispers bypassed his eardrums, vibrating directly into his skull. In the flickering shadows, he saw the shapes of people he had wronged taking form against the peeling floral patterns. The manor had become an interrogation room, and the only way out was through the total collapse of his mind. Evelyn stepped out of the darkness of the parlor, her hand trembling as she pointed at him. Her voice rose to a shriek, accusing him of bringing a city rot into their ancestral home. She claimed his presence had acted as a catalyst, a pollutant that had stirred the rage of Silas in his fresh grave. According to her, the ground only shook because Caleb's feet touched it, and the ghosts only found their voices because he had provided them with fresh sins to feed on. Caleb backed away, watching the firelight dance in her eyes, a look of unmistakable, twisted triumph. Evelyn declared that Silas had anticipated this return, and that the house was merely fulfilling the old man's final, unspoken will. Using the blade of a pocket knife, Caleb forced the lock on Silas's private study. The wood groaned and splintered as the bolt gave way. The air inside was thick with the ghost of stale pipe tobacco and the sour smell of decaying paper. Caleb brushed a heavy layer of gray dust from the oak desk, revealing a set of architectural blueprints spread out like a map of a battlefield. Silas's red ink had slashed across the diagrams in erratic zigzags, marking hidden cavities and voids within the load-bearing walls that defied standard construction. Caleb picked up a journal bound in rough, scarred leather. The title, Family Whispers, was scrawled across the front in his father's jagged, aggressive handwriting. Just touching the cover sent a jolt of cold through Caleb's fingertips, a sensation that made his skin crawl. The door to the study slammed against the wall, and Evelyn burst in like a bird of prey. Her face was a contorted mask of frantic energy. She lunged for the journal, her bony fingers clawing at the leather as she tried to wrench it from Caleb's grasp. Her nails scraped against the cover, leaving deep, white gouges. She screamed that he had no right to the old man's secrets, that he was already infected. She claimed she could see the same mad fire in his eyes that had consumed every Hayes man before him. Spittle flew from her lips as she accused him of hearing the stones, insisting that the ancestral curse was now coursing through his veins like black bile. Caleb shoved her back and turned his attention to the frantic entries in the diary. Silas had written about the granite foundation acting as a conductor, translating the voices of the dead into vibrations that turned the bones of the living into tuning forks. Caleb felt a dull, rhythmic throb begin at the base of his skull. He reached for a pencil to mark a passage, but his hand froze. The letters he began to form on the page had the same violent tilt, the same hooked edges as his father's script. He stared at his own shaking fingers, unable to distinguish his handwriting from that of the dead man. A layer of ice seemed to form over his heart as the realization hit. His mind wasn't just failing. It was actively mimicking the architecture of his father's insanity. The sky outside the study window curdled into the color of a fresh bruise, and a sudden peal of thunder made the glass rattle in its frames. A violent gust of wind screamed through the hollow, slamming into the ancient pine that had stood guard near the entrance for a century. Caleb heard a catastrophic crack, a sound like a cannon firing. The massive trunk tore through the roof of the entrance hall, bringing down a mountain of slate shingles and splintering rafters. Dust and powdered insulation choked the air, turning it into a gray fog. Caleb watched through the doorway as the debris completely choked the exit, sealing the house like a tomb. The roar of the storm outside merged with the triumphant howl of the wind whistling through the new gaps in the structure. Caleb sprinted toward the wreckage, his fingers digging into the jagged edges of the broken timber. His fingernails tore, leaving smears of blood on the white plaster dust. Through a gap in the splintered wall, he caught a glimpse of the rain-lashed garden. In the gray sheets of the downpour, standing among the twisted apple trees, was a motionless figure. The familiar, heavy hunting cloak of Silas Hayes hung from the broad shoulders, the hem whipping in the gale. Caleb stopped breathing, the sweat on his forehead turning to ice. The silhouette didn't move. It just stared back at him with what looked like empty, dark pits where eyes should be. Caleb rubbed his eyes, but the image only sharpened against the thrashing greenery, a silent invitation to join the old man in the dirt. Evelyn grabbed Caleb's elbow, her grip surprisingly strong, and hauled him toward the kitchen. Spread across the scarred wooden table were a series of glossy photographs. Caleb looked down and felt a wave of nausea. In every shot, his own face had been digitally or physically superimposed over images of Silas, creating a blurred, monstrous hybrid with a double set of teeth and a manic stare. Evelyn slid a yellowed document from a psychiatric facility over the photos, a commitment form with Caleb's name already filled in. She whispered that the diagnosis was a foregone conclusion. No one in the county would question the word of a sister when the brother was clearly following the father's descent. Caleb saw the predatory gleam in her eyes as she shuffled the papers with the practiced ease of a card shark. She pushed a heavy fountain pen toward him, along with a formal renunciation of the estate. Her eyes narrowed into dark slits. She hissed that if he didn't sign away his rights immediately, she would lock him in the cellar kennel, where Silas used to break the hunting hounds. She promised him a life of care and total isolation until the orderlies came to haul the last of the Hayes men away. Caleb felt her hand tighten on his shoulder, a gesture devoid of any warmth, purely the calculated pressure of a hunter pinning a wounded animal. He realized then that Evelyn was willing to fabricate an entire reality of madness, just to ensure the hollow remained hers and hers alone. Caleb broke away from her and fled to his upstairs room, grabbing his travel bag from the bed. He yanked the zipper, but instead of his belongings, a mass of shredded fabric spilled out. Every shirt, every pair of trousers had been meticulously sliced into thin ribbons, as if by a razor. At the bottom of the bag, nestled among the ruins of his clothes, lay the stiff, gray corpse of a rat. A long, dark strand of Evelyn's hair was wound tightly around the rodent's neck, biting deep into the cold flesh. Caleb recoiled, the smell of decay suddenly filling the small room. He realized she had been systematically erasing every link he had to the world outside the hollow, leaving him with nothing but the scent of the grave. Thirsty and shaking, Caleb reached for a cup of tea he'd left on the nightstand. The first swallow hit his tongue with an oily, chemical bitterness that made his throat seize. He spat the liquid onto the rug, watching as a dark, iridescent stain spread, smelling strongly of aconite and monkshood. He looked at the dregs and realized she had been lacing his food and drink with toxic herbs, blurring his perception and inducing the very hallucinations she accused him of having. His throat began to go numb, and a high-pitched ringing started in his ears. He looked up to see Evelyn standing in the doorway, her face unreadable, and he knew that every meal in this house had been a slow-acting poison disguised as hospitality. The rhythmic thrumming in the walls intensified into a roar that made Caleb's teeth ache. In a fit of desperate rage, he dug his fingernails into a loose seam of the wallpaper and ripped a long strip away, baring the wood beneath. The timber was covered in deep, deliberate gouges. Silas had carved ritualistic symbols directly into the house's skeleton, intertwined serpents, weeping eyes, and geometric sigils. Caleb tore away more paper, exposing an altar of madness that spanned the entire room. The carvings seemed to pulse and shift in his blurred vision, moving in time with his own frantic heartbeat. He screamed at the ceiling, a sound of pure exhaustion, realizing the house wasn't just a dwelling. It was a massive wooden machine designed to grind his identity into dust. Evelyn suddenly shoved him into the formal dining room and slammed the heavy oak door. The click of the key in the lock sounded like a hammer falling on a firing pin. The last candle in the room sputtered and died, plunging Caleb into a darkness so thick it felt like water. From the other side of the door, Evelyn's voice drifted in, a soft, melodic whisper. She began to recount how she had performed the final rites for Silas while he was still breathing, preparing him for his transition into the house itself. Her voice shook with a disturbing, religious fervor as she described the old man's final tremors and the specific, grisly instructions he had left for the disposal of his remains. Caleb pressed his hands over his ears, but her words seemed to bypass the wood, poisoning his mind with images that could never be unseen. Caleb collapsed to his knees in the center of the dark room, surrounded by the invisible weight of the house. Above him, the ceiling groaned under the impossible mass of the fallen pine. He felt the floorboards begin to vibrate with a low-frequency hum that slowly morphed into the dry, mocking laughter of Silas Hayes, coming from the floor, the walls, and the very air itself. Outside the door, Evelyn's laughter joined the chorus, the two voices blending into a single, terrifying chord. Caleb felt the walls beginning to lean inward, the darkness pressing against his chest until he could no longer draw a full breath. Caleb's fingers searched the wall until they snagged the edge of a heavy, dust-caked tapestry. With a desperate grunt, he ripped the fabric down. It came away with a dry shriek, releasing a cloud of grit that sent him into a coughing fit. Behind the hanging lay a low, arched door he'd never noticed, its surface slick with a translucent film of mold. A draft of air, smelling of stagnant water and ancient rot, whistled through the frame. He pressed the hidden ring latch, and the door swung inward, revealing a black, vertical tunnel choked with thick swathes of cobwebs. The darkness inside looked solid, like a pool of ink. But Caleb stepped into the void anyway, driven by a need to find the source of the noise. His boots slipped on the stone steps, which were coated in a layer of prehistoric slime. The staircase spiraled down into the very guts of the hill. The walls here wept moisture, and cold droplets hit the back of his neck, causing his muscles to seize. Suddenly, Silas's voice exploded in the narrow space, the volume so immense it felt like a physical blow. The sound resonated off the low stone ceiling, piercing Caleb's eardrums with a sharp, stabbing pain. He felt a warmth on his upper lip and wiped it away. His hand came back smeared with dark, thick blood. His nose was hemorrhaging from the sheer pressure of the sound. He gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to vomit, and continued his descent into the thundering dark. He reached the bottom step and was momentarily blinded by the rhythmic blinking of a dozen red indicator lights. In the center of the vaulted cellar, surrounded by a forest of rusted iron support beams, Evelyn sat on her haunches. She had arranged a grotesque semicircle of reel-to-reel tape recorders, their spools spinning in a frantic, stuttering dance. The magnetic tape hissed and popped, vomiting out distorted, overlapping sermons in Silas's voice. The sounds crashed together, creating a wall of white noise and hatred. Evelyn rocked back and forth, her fingers tangled in a mess of loose tape like she was disemboweling a plastic animal. The dim light caught the jagged, manic grin on her face as the recorded voice of their father demanded blood and penance. Evelyn snapped her head up, and the light glinted off the steel blades of a pair of heavy, rusted garden shears. She lunged at him, the tool held high, her scream piercing through the roar of the tapes. She shrieked about the purity of the line and how Caleb's bones would finally stabilize the foundation of the house. He saw the veins corded in her neck and the froth flecking her lips. The serrated blade snapped shut inches from his throat. She moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, her bare feet silent on the stone as she drove him back toward a stack of granite blocks that looked like an unfinished tomb. Caleb dropped low, the shears whistling through the air where his head had been a second before. He threw his entire weight against a precarious metal equipment rack. The shelves collapsed with a deafening crash, sending the heavy tape recorders tumbling to the concrete. He heard the satisfying crunch of plastic and the pop of vacuum tubes. A cascade of brilliant white sparks erupted from the severed power cords, illuminating the cellar in a series of strobing flashes. The smell of ozone and scorched copper filled the room. A short circuit surged through the remaining machines, causing the reels to jerk and smoke. Caleb scrambled back as one of the units exploded, peppering the area around Evelyn with shards of glass and hot metal. A silence so profound it made his ears ring suddenly descended on the cellar. The machines were dead, emitting only thin curls of acrid smoke. But the peace lasted only a heartbeat. Caleb leaned his hand against a massive granite block and recoiled as if he'd touched a hot stove. From deep within the stone came a chorus of thousands of tiny, overlapping whispers. It wasn't a recording. The sound was being generated by the very molecular structure of the rock, a vibration that made his marrow ache. He watched Evelyn freeze, her head cocked, as the hollow, collective voice of 100 years of Hayes's resentment began to bleed out of the cracks in the floor. The walls of the cellar began to shiver, shedding layers of ancient dust and lime. Caleb watched in horror as a thick, blue-black fluid began to weep from the joints between the stones. It moved with a slow, purposeful viscosity, smelling of old blood and wet iron. He tried to back away, but the fluid was already pooling in the depressions of the floor, inching toward his boots. The substance pulsed with a visible rhythm, as if a giant heart were beating somewhere beneath the foundation. The cellar no longer felt like a room. It felt like the interior of a living, hemorrhaging organ that was intent on drowning him. Evelyn collapsed into the black sludge, her forehead striking the stone floor with a sickening thud. She began to beat her head against the floor rhythmically, leaving a fresh smear of red with every impact. Her voice had devolved into a whimpering, animalistic rasp, pleading with the shadow of Silas to take Caleb as the final offering. She clawed at the stone until her fingernails bled, trying to reach the source of the black fluid. Caleb saw her eyes roll back, leaving only the whites visible as she surrendered her consciousness to the house. She wasn't his sister anymore. She was a conduit for the Hollow's hunger. He lunged forward and grabbed her shoulders, trying to shake her back to reality. Her skin felt like ice, and her clothes were sodden with the black filth. As he gripped her, the floor beneath them bucked. A massive, rolling tremor surged through the earth, as if a leviathan were turning over in its sleep. Caleb lost his footing as the concrete slabs beneath him began to pull apart, revealing a pulsing, bottomless void. Evelyn threw her head back and let out a piercing cry of joy as the entire structure of the manor groaned and twisted above them. Caleb felt the weight of the hill pressing down, the support beams screaming under the strain of the waking earth. The last of the lights flickered out, but the cellar remained visible in a dim, sickly luminescence. From the weeping walls, dense clusters of shadow began to detach themselves, coalescing into the shapes of gaunt, elongated human figures. These spectral silhouettes of the Hayes ancestors closed in around them, their empty eye sockets radiating a focused, ancient spite. The air became thick and bitter, tasting of copper and old grief. Caleb felt their translucent, skeletal fingers brush against his skin, each touch leaving a trail of freezing agony. The cellar seemed to shrink, becoming a vortex of faces that had been erased by time, but preserved by their shared hatred for the living. Caleb looked at the wreckage of the tape recorders and realized the magnitude of their error. Evelyn's mechanical trickery had been a key in a lock that should have remained turned. Her manufactured madness had acted as a frequency, resonating with the ancient, toxic consciousness of the Hollow itself. It wasn't Silas's ghost that was the primary threat. It was the land, poisoned by generations of violence, that had finally found its voice. Her imitation had invited the genuine article, and now the Hollow was claiming its due. He watched as the black fluid began to wrap around Evelyn's legs like grasping, ink-stained tentacles. He felt his back pressed against a wall that had become soft and alarmingly warm, like the flank of a living beast. The stone beneath his palms was thumping with a frantic, wet pulse that mirrored his own. His strength began to evaporate, his vision blurring into a haze of dark spots. The air was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating pressure that demanded he stop fighting and simply dissolve into the foundation of the house. Caleb's hands, which had been clawing at the stone, slowly relaxed. He let them fall to his sides, the tension draining out of his frame like water from a broken vessel. The frantic pulse in his neck subsided, leaving behind a hollow, echoing stillness. He stood straight, looking directly into Evelyn's dilated pupils, where the last sparks of the dying electronics were reflected. His gaze went flat and glassy, a look of total detachment. He no longer flinched when a piece of the ceiling hit the floor or when she raised the rusted blades again. A shroud of quietude settled over him, extinguishing his anger like a handful of sand on a dying fire. He spoke, and the words were the only clear thing in the room. He told her she could have it. He told her that every rot-filled timber, every poisoned apple, and every screaming stone was now her sole property. He formally surrendered every inch of the hollow to her, gifting her the ghosts and the shadows and the weight of the name. He told her she was free to stay and decay in the dark, but that he was no longer a part of the equation. His words fell into the black sludge without a sound, but they acted as a psychic blade, severing the invisible cords that had tethered him to the house. Evelyn froze. The garden shears hovered inches from his throat, her hand trembling with a sudden, violent uncertainty. Her face twisted as the rage she had been fueling found no resistance to push against. She slowly lowered the tool, the metallic click sounding pathetic in the wake of Caleb's silence. She searched his face for a flicker of the old fear, some sign of the brother she could manipulate. But she found only a blank, icy wall of indifference. Her own energy seemed to leak out of her, her posture sagging as she realized that her victory was a hollow one. He was leaving her with a kingdom of ash. Caleb turned his back on her, completely unconcerned with the threat of a strike. He walked across the debris of the recorders, the sound of breaking plastic under his boots, the only thing he could hear. The shadows of the ancestors reached for him, but their fingers couldn't find a grip. They slid through his skin like smoke through a screen door. The vibrations of the floor, which had nearly shattered his mind minutes ago, were now just the distant hum of a machine that didn't belong to him. He walked toward the stairs, leaving the pulsing 100-year-old darkness behind, his heart no longer beating in time with the house. He emerged into the entrance hall, where the air was suddenly fresh with the scent of rain. The morning light was beginning to filter through the wreckage of the roof, illuminating the dust motes in a pale silver glow. He grabbed a branch of the fallen pine and hauled himself through the gap in the wall, the wet needles scratching his face and neck. He scrambled over the splintered rafters and dropped onto the sodden grass of the yard. He didn't look back at the house, which stood like a broken, jagged tooth against the sky. He just stood there for a moment, letting the real wind wash the smell of the cellar from his lungs. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy brass keys and the rolled-up inheritance papers. The metal still felt uncomfortably warm, as if it carried a fever. With a single, fluid motion, he hurled the entire bundle into the thick, orange mud at the base of the porch. The papers immediately began to soak up the filth, the legal text blurring into illegibility, while the keys vanished into the muck with a soft, wet thud. He watched the clay close over the symbols of his ownership, burying the Hayes legacy under a layer of rot and dead leaves where it belonged. From deep within the house, a final wet sound erupted, the voice of Silas, screaming his name one last time. It was a sound of pure, impotent fury, a jagged rasp that made the remaining window panes shiver. It tried to reach out and snag him, to pull him back into the cycle of hatred. Caleb didn't even pause. He continued down the gravel drive, his pace steady and rhythmic. The scream rose to a frantic, piercing pitch and then simply snapped, falling away into the trees, unable to find any purchase in the man who was already gone. He reached the Kavani Varota, where the rust was beaded with cold morning dew. At the edge of the property, the fog was finally breaking apart, revealing a sliver of hard, gray sky on the horizon. The first light of the sun was sharp and clinical, cutting through the shadows of the pines. The air here was thin and cold, devoid of the scent of incense or old blood. Caleb stepped over the invisible line that marked the boundary of the Hayes land, and he felt the physical weight on his shoulders, a pressure he'd carried since childhood, simply evaporate into the morning mist. He climbed into the truck and jammed the key into the ignition. This time, the engine roared to life, with a healthy, aggressive growl. The dashboard lit up in a warm, amber glow, and the wipers cleared the needles and dust from the glass. He shifted into gear, the transmission clicking into place with a solid, reassuring thud. The heavy tires gripped the gravel and pulled the truck out of the mud. And Caleb turned the wheel toward the main road, leaving the silence of the hollow to settle back into its own decay. As the truck reached the asphalt, he caught a glimpse of the house in the rearview mirror. Evelyn was standing on the highest point of the porch wreckage, her light-colored dress whipping around her legs. She looked like a small, pale ghost against the dark wood of the manor. The shadows were already closing in around her, spilling out of the open door to reclaim her. She didn't move, and she didn't wave. She just watched him go until the road curved and the forest swallowed the sight of her and the house whole. He accelerated, the wind whistling through the gap in the window. Then, in the quiet of the cab, he heard it, a soft, dry whisper right next to his ear. It was Silas, using that same old nickname, his voice full of a dark, intimate warmth. Caleb felt the passenger seat dip slightly, as if someone had just sat down beside him. The sharp, unmistakable smell of cheap pipe tobacco filled the small space, thick and cloying. He didn't look over, but he felt the invisible presence settle in for the long haul, the dry, hacking laugh of his father echoing softly against the glass. Caleb's grip on the steering wheel tightened until the leather groaned. He stared straight ahead at the empty road, but the ritualistic symbols from the cellar walls were burned into his retinas, pulsing with every flash of the passing trees. The whisper in his ear began to sync up with the rhythm of the engine, a steady, inescapable commentary on his escape. He realized then that the hollow hadn't been a place he could leave behind. It was a part of his own architecture, a haunting that lived in his blood and his bones. He drove on, but he knew the silence of the city would never be enough to drown out the inheritance he carried within him.